Settle back and let your mind wander through the quiet halls of power, where America's deepest secrets rest in silence. Beneath the marble columns and grand reading rooms of Washington, D.C.'s most prestigious institutions lies a different kind of library, one most Americans will never see. In the restricted sections of the Smithsonian, the classified vaults of the Library of Congress, and the sealed archives of the National Archives, documents gather dust that could rewrite everything you thought you knew about American history. For over 2 centuries, our government has maintained a careful balance between transparency and secrecy, between the stories we tell ourselves and the truths we keep hidden. Freedom of Information Act requests are denied, researchers are turned away, and entire floors remain off-limits to the public. The official reason is always national security. But what if the real purpose is far more unsettling? Tonight we'll journey through America's hidden archives, where colonial conspiracies rest beside suppressed scientific discoveries, where Native American wisdom was deliberately buried, and where the true costs of westward expansion remain classified. We'll uncover how institutional secrecy has shaped not just our past, but our present. Close your eyes and follow us into the shadows of American power, where knowledge sleeps and truth waits patiently for the courage to be revealed. Walk through the grand marble halls of the Library of Congress on any given weekday, and you'll see tourists marveling at the ornate Jefferson Building, researchers quietly studying in the main reading room, and staff members going about their daily routines. What you won't see, what the public is never meant to see, are the levels that don't appear on any official floor plan. Dr. Patricia Caldwell, a former congressional researcher who spent 15 years working with classified materials, describes it simply. There's another library beneath the library, and most Americans have no idea it exists. The Thomas Jefferson Building, that stunning Beaux-Arts masterpiece that serves as the crown jewel of American knowledge, extends far deeper underground than any public tour will reveal. Beyond the familiar basement storage areas and mechanical rooms lies a network of climate-controlled vaults, restricted reading rooms, and document storage facilities that require security clearances most university professors will never obtain. These aren't just overflow storage areas or backup systems. They're deliberately designed spaces for materials deemed too sensitive for general scholarly access. When Freedom of Information Act requests are filed seeking access to historical documents, the responses often cite exemptions for national security or ongoing investigations. But what kind of ongoing investigations could possibly involve colonial-era correspondence or 19th-century territorial surveys? The answer, according to former librarians who've worked in these restricted sections, lies in the uncomfortable truth that American institutions have spent decades carefully curating which version of history the public gets to see. The Smithsonian Institution presents an even more complex puzzle. While millions of visitors each year explore the Natural History Museum, the Air and Space Museum, and the American History Museum, few realize that the Smithsonian's research facilities extend far beyond these public spaces. Behind unmarked doors in the Museum Support Center in Suitland, Maryland, and in basement levels of the Castle building itself, lie collections that researchers like Dr. Andrew Sterling have described as the Other America, artifacts, documents, and specimens that tell stories the institution has chosen not to share. Sterling, who worked as a curator for 12 years before leaving in frustration over access restrictions, recalls being shown storage areas containing Native American artifacts that contradicted established timelines of technological development. We had evidence of sophisticated metallurgy, astronomical instruments, and engineering capabilities that predated European contact by centuries, he explains. But these materials were classified as culturally sensitive and removed from research circulation. When Sterling attempted to publish his findings, his access was revoked and his research materials confiscated. The pattern extends throughout Washington's institutional landscape. The National Archives, that imposing neoclassical temple to American democracy, maintains entire floors of classified materials that span from colonial times to the present. Dr. Helen Morrison, a former archivist who spent 23 years working with restricted documents, describes a system designed less for national security than for narrative control. The classification system isn't about protecting state secrets, Morrison explains during a rare interview at her Virginia home. It's about protecting institutional reputations. We have documents showing that government officials knew about environmental disasters decades before they became public knowledge, correspondence revealing that territorial expansion involved systematic deception of native tribes, and scientific reports that were buried because they contradicted politically convenient narratives. The mechanics of this system are surprisingly straightforward. Documents are classified not by intelligence agencies, but by the institutions themselves. A simple designation of historically sensitive or culturally protected can remove materials from public access indefinitely. Unlike military or diplomatic secrets, these classifications have no review process and no declassification timeline. Once a document disappears into the restricted sections, it can remain there for generations. The underground levels of these institutions tell their own story. Former maintenance worker James Fitzgerald, who spent 8 years servicing the environmental systems in the Library of Congress sub-basements, describes vast climate-controlled storage areas filled with filing cabinets and document boxes that stretch into darkness. The tour guides talk about millions of items in the collection, he recalls, but they never mention that half of those items are in areas the public will never access. I've seen entire floors dedicated to what they called administrative materials, boxes and boxes of documents that looked nothing like routine paperwork. The security measures surrounding these hidden collections reveal their true significance. Access requires not just academic credentials, but background checks that can take months to complete. Researchers who do gain entry describe signing non-disclosure agreements that extend far beyond their research period, essentially silencing them for life about what they've seen. Dr. Melissa Crawford, a historian who spent 2 years attempting to access colonial-era documents for her research on early American trade relationships, eventually abandoned her project after repeated denials. They told me the materials I was requesting contained ongoing privacy concerns, Crawford recalls. I was researching documents from the 1760s. What privacy concerns could possibly exist for people who died 2.5 centuries ago? The answer, she discovered, wasn't about privacy. It was about protecting modern institutions from uncomfortable historical truths. The digital age has only made this selective curation more sophisticated. Electronic databases can restrict access to specific documents while making their existence known to researchers, creating the illusion of transparency while maintaining effective censorship. Freedom of Information Act requests are processed through automated systems that can delay responses for years, while generating paper trails that give the appearance of compliance. What emerges from this investigation isn't just a story about government secrecy, but about how institutions shape historical memory itself. The question isn't simply what documents are being hidden, but why the very foundations of American history might require such careful protection from public scrutiny. And that question leads us to examine the earliest chapters of that hidden history. The mythology of America's founding rests on carefully curated stories of noble patriots fighting for freedom and democracy. But deep within the classified sections of our greatest libraries lies a different narrative. One that reveals the Founding Fathers as shrewd businessmen, pragmatic politicians, and sometimes ruthless strategists whose true motivations have been systematically obscured from public view. Dr. Charles Whitfield, a colonial historian who spent 3 decades attempting to access restricted documents from the Revolutionary period, puts it bluntly. The sanitized version of American independence we teach in schools bears little resemblance to the messy, complicated, and often morally ambiguous reality. The Massachusetts Historical Society maintains what they call the sensitive collections, correspondence between colonial leaders that contains language and attitudes deemed inappropriate for public consumption. These letters, according to former archivist Susan Whitfield, reveal founding fathers who were deeply concerned about maintaining their business interests, protecting their slave holdings, and ensuring that independence wouldn't disrupt the profitable trade relationships they'd built with European merchants. We have letters showing that some of the most revered patriots were secretly negotiating with British officials even while publicly calling for revolution, she explains. The decision to pursue independence wasn't driven purely by idealistic principles. It was a calculated business decision. The Virginia Historical Society houses even more troubling documents in their restricted archives. Former research director Timothy Caldwell spent 8 years cataloging colonial-era business records before his access was abruptly terminated. His work revealed extensive financial networks connecting Virginia plantation owners with British textile manufacturers, Dutch shipping companies, and Caribbean sugar traders. What we discovered was that many founding fathers weren't just fighting for political independence, Caldwell explains. They were protecting a complex web of international business relationships that generated enormous wealth. The revolution was as much about trade control as it was about taxation without representation. The most closely guarded documents involve treaties and agreements with Native American tribes. Professor Angela Morrison, who attempted to research colonial land acquisition practices, describes being denied access to treaty documents that date back to the 1640s. The official explanation was that these materials contain sensitive information about ongoing tribal relations, she recalls. But we're talking about agreements made over 3 centuries ago with tribes that no longer exist as political entities. The real concern seems to be that these documents would expose the systematic deception and fraud that characterized colonial expansion. The Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Indian maintains its own restricted archive of colonial correspondence. Dr. Patrick Sterling, who worked as a consultant on Native American historical materials, discovered letters between colonial governors and tribal leaders that paint a drastically different picture of early American diplomacy than the cooperative narratives taught in textbooks. These letters show colonial leaders making promises they had no intention of keeping, Sterling reveals. They would sign treaties guaranteeing tribal sovereignty over specific territories, then immediately begin planning how to circumvent those agreements through legal technicalities or manufactured conflicts. The sophistication of the deception was remarkable. They were essentially running confidence schemes on a continental scale. The Revolutionary War period presents its own troubling revelations. The Library of Congress maintains classified collections of correspondence between American revolutionary leaders and foreign powers that reveal a pattern of double-dealing that would shock most Americans. Dr. Margaret Fitzgerald, who spent 12 years researching diplomatic history before her security clearance was revoked, describes letters showing American negotiators making contradictory promises to French, Spanish, and even British officials. The Founding Fathers were playing all sides, she explains. They would promise territorial concessions to Spain while simultaneously offering the same lands to France, betting that they could resolve the conflicts after achieving independence. Perhaps most disturbing are the financial records showing how revolutionary leaders profited personally from the war effort. Documents in the Pennsylvania Historical Society's restricted collections reveal Founding Fathers awarding lucrative supply contracts to companies they secretly owned, manipulating currency values to benefit their personal investments, and using their political positions to acquire land that they knew would increase dramatically in value after independence. These weren't isolated cases of corruption. They represent systematic exploitation of public service for private gain. The cover-up extends beyond individual corruption to institutional deception on a massive scale. Modern historians have discovered that entire categories of colonial documents have been reclassified or removed from public access whenever they threaten to undermine cherished national narratives. Dr. Harold Brennan, who worked for 15 years in the National Archives Colonial Division, before retiring in frustration, describes a systematic process of historical sanitization. Whenever documents surfaced that showed the Founding Fathers in an unflattering light, as slave traders, land speculators, or political opportunists, they would mysteriously disappear into special collections or be deemed too fragile for research access. The implications of this selective curation extend far beyond academic curiosity. If the foundational stories of American democracy are built on carefully edited versions of historical truth, what does that say about the institutions those stories were designed to legitimize? The restricted colonial documents suggest that American independence wasn't the noble struggle for freedom and justice portrayed in textbooks, but a complex business venture undertaken by wealthy elites who used idealistic rhetoric to mobilize popular support for their economic interests. This pattern of institutional mythology making didn't end with the colonial period. It became a template for how American institutions would handle inconvenient truths throughout the nation's history. But perhaps nowhere is this template more clearly visible than in the systematic suppression of Native American knowledge systems, where entire civilizations' worth of wisdom was deliberately buried to support narratives of American exceptionalism. The systematic erasure of Native American intellectual achievements represents one of the most profound acts of cultural vandalism in human history. What most Americans don't realize is that this erasure continues today, not through violent conquest, but through the quiet suppression of documents and artifacts that would fundamentally challenge everything we've been taught about pre-Columbian civilization. Dr. Amanda Crawford, an anthropologist who spent 2 decades attempting to access restricted Native American collections, describes encountering a pattern of institutional resistance that suggests a deliberate effort to maintain historical narratives that diminish indigenous achievements. The Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Indian houses what researchers call the sensitive collections, thousands of documents, artifacts, and recorded oral histories that are deemed too controversial for public display or academic research. These materials, according to former curator Dr. Jeffrey Caldwell, include evidence of sophisticated astronomical observatories, advanced metallurgical techniques, and political systems that influence the development of democratic principles centuries before European contact. We have documentation showing that Pueblo astronomers were tracking celestial cycles with accuracy that rivals modern observatories, Caldwell explains. Their stone calendars and architectural alignments demonstrate mathematical and engineering capabilities that contradict every assumption about primitive indigenous cultures. The restrictions surrounding these materials aren't justified by concerns about cultural sensitivity or tribal sovereignty. Many of the tribes whose knowledge is being suppressed no longer exist as organized political entities. Instead, these restrictions appear designed to protect academic and governmental institutions from having to acknowledge that their foundational narratives about American civilization are fundamentally flawed. Professor Helen Morrison, who worked for 15 years studying Iroquois governmental documents before her access was terminated, discovered constitutional frameworks that predate the Magna Carta and demonstrate levels of democratic sophistication that European political theorists wouldn't develop for centuries. The Iroquois Constitution wasn't just a simple tribal agreement, Morrison explains during a rare interview at her home in upstate New York. It was a complex federal system with checks and balances, separation of powers, and democratic representation that influenced the Founding Fathers far more than they ever acknowledged. We have documented evidence that founders, like Jefferson and Franklin, studied Iroquois political structures extensively, but those connections have been systematically minimized in historical accounts. The Library of Congress maintains entire floors of restricted materials related to indigenous knowledge systems. Dr. Thomas Whitfield, who spent 8 years cataloging these collections before his security clearance was revoked, describes encountering mathematical texts, astronomical charts, and engineering manuals that demonstrate intellectual achievements that European scholars of the time couldn't match. We found evidence of decimal number systems, sophisticated calendars that account for celestial precession, and architectural techniques that require understanding of advanced physics, he recalls. These weren't primitive societies. They were civilizations with knowledge bases that in many areas exceeded European capabilities. The suppression extends beyond academic institutions to government agencies that continue to classify materials related to indigenous knowledge systems. The Bureau of Indian Affairs maintains archives that former employees describe as containing evidence of pre-Columbian trade networks spanning both American continents. Dr. Patricia Sterling, who worked as a consultant analyzing these materials, discovered documentation of sophisticated transportation systems, standardized weights and measures, and communication networks that connected civilizations from Alaska to Peru. The scope of these networks was staggering, Sterling reveals. We found evidence of coordinated astronomical observations being conducted simultaneously across thousands of miles, suggesting communication systems and organizational capabilities that challenge fundamental assumptions about indigenous societies. There were trade goods moving from the Great Lakes to Central America, standardized tool technologies appearing in locations separated by vast distances, and mathematical concepts being shared across cultures that supposedly had no contact with each other. Perhaps most significantly, these restricted collections contain detailed records of environmental management practices that sustained large populations for millennia without ecological collapse. Native American agricultural techniques, forest management systems, and water conservation methods demonstrate environmental science principles that modern ecologists are only beginning to understand. Dr. Martin Fitzgerald, who attempted to research indigenous land management practices for the Department of Agriculture, describes being denied access to documents that could revolutionize modern environmental policy. The documents I was shown contain detailed ecological surveys conducted by indigenous communities over centuries, Fitzgerald explains. They had developed sustainable farming techniques that could feed large populations without soil depletion, forest management practices that prevented wildfires while maintaining biodiversity, and water conservation systems that functioned for thousands of years. This knowledge could solve many of our current environmental crises, but it remains locked away in classified collections. The implications of this systematic suppression extend far beyond academic curiosity. If Native American civilizations possessed advanced knowledge systems that were deliberately hidden to justify colonial conquest and cultural genocide, then the foundational narratives of American exceptionalism crumble under scrutiny. The primitive societies that European colonists claimed to be civilizing were actually sophisticated civilizations with intellectual achievements that in many areas surpassed European capabilities. But modern DNA studies and archaeological discoveries continue to challenge official timelines, revealing evidence of complex civilizations, advanced technologies, and continental trade networks that predate European contact by millennia. Yet access to the documentary evidence that could contextualize these discoveries remains restricted, buried in the classified collections of institutions that seem more concerned with protecting historical narratives than pursuing historical truth. But the suppression of indigenous knowledge represents only one dimension of institutional secrecy, surrounding early American science and technology. Even more troubling are the classified files suggesting that American technological capabilities advanced far more rapidly than official records indicate, with innovations and discoveries that were systematically hidden to protect economic and political interests. The official history of American scientific development portrays a steady progression from colonial simplicity to industrial sophistication, with major breakthroughs occurring predictably throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. But buried within the classified archives of the Patent Office, the Smithsonian Institution, and various government agencies lies evidence of a far more complex reality. One where American inventors and scientists achieved remarkable breakthroughs decades or even centuries before conventional timelines suggest, only to have their work suppressed, confiscated, or systematically erased from the historical record. Dr. Andrew Caldwell, who spent 15 years working as a patent examiner before his security clearance was revoked, describes encountering applications for inventions that seemed impossibly advanced for their time periods. We had patent applications from the 1790s describing steam-powered vehicles with specifications that wouldn't be invented until the 1860s, he explains during a rare interview at his Maryland home. There were detailed plans for mechanical calculators submitted in the early 1800s that used gear ratios and computational principles that Charles Babbage supposedly pioneered decades later. The sophistication of these early American inventors was extraordinary, but their work was systematically buried. The pattern of suppression appears to follow economic rather than security concerns. Patent applications that threatened established industries or challenged monopolistic practices were routinely denied or classified, with inventors sometimes finding their workshops raided and their materials confiscated by federal marshals. Professor Helen Morrison, who researched early American scientific societies before her access to historical materials was restricted, discovered that colonial-era inventors were producing work that challenged fundamental assumptions about technological development. We found detailed journals describing experiments with electricity conducted in the 1740s, decades before Franklin's famous kite experiment, she reveals. These weren't simple observations about static electricity, but systematic studies of electrical conductivity, storage methods, and even primitive battery designs. The level of scientific rigor was remarkable. The Smithsonian's classified collections contain what former curator Dr. Timothy Sterling describes as the other Industrial Revolution. Evidence of American inventors developing advanced machinery, chemical processes, and engineering solutions that wouldn't appear in official histories until much later periods. Sterling recalls examining detailed technical drawings from the early 1800s showing steam engines with efficiency ratings that supposedly weren't achieved until the 1870s, textile machinery that incorporated design principles attributed to later inventors, and metallurgical processes that produced steel alloys decades before the Bessemer process was officially developed. The pattern was always the same, Sterling explains. An inventor would develop something revolutionary, apply for a patent, and then suddenly find their application denied for national security reasons or economic stability concerns. Their workshops would be searched, their materials confiscated, and often the inventors themselves would be pressured to relocate or change their research focus. The government's role in this systematic suppression becomes clear when examining the records of early patent disputes. Dr. Patricia Whitfield, who worked for 12 years in the Patent Office's historical division before retiring, describes a classification system that had little to do with genuine national security concerns. We had inventors in the 1820s developing improved printing presses that would have revolutionized newspaper production, but their patents were denied because they threatened the profits of established publishing companies that had government contracts, she explains. There were agricultural innovations that could have dramatically increased crop yields, but they were suppressed because they would have disrupted existing trade relationships with European suppliers. The influence of established business interests on scientific suppression extends throughout American history. Chemical processes that could have produced cheaper fertilizers, mechanical designs that would have made manufacturing more efficient, and transportation innovations that could have transformed commerce were all systematically buried to protect existing economic arrangements. Dr. Jeffrey Morrison, who attempted to research early American industrial development, discovered that many supposedly foreign technologies introduced to America in the mid-1800s were actually based on designs that American inventors had developed decades earlier. We found evidence that American inventors had developed steamboat designs superior to Robert Fulton's decades before his famous demonstrations, Morrison reveals. But these earlier inventors lacked the political connections and financial backing necessary to overcome the resistance of established shipping interests who profited from slower, less efficient transportation methods. The most troubling aspect of this scientific suppression involves research that could have prevented environmental disasters or saved lives. The National Archives maintains classified files containing early studies of industrial pollution, mining safety innovations, and public health research that were buried to protect corporate interests. Dr. Margaret Fitzgerald, who worked as a government science advisor before being dismissed for attempting to declassify historical research, describes encountering studies from the 1850s, showing that American scientists understood the health risks of industrial chemicals, the environmental impact of large-scale mining, and the dangers of unregulated manufacturing processes. These weren't primitive observations, Fitzgerald explains. They were comprehensive scientific studies with statistical analysis, control groups, and peer review processes. American scientists were producing work that met modern standards of scientific rigor, but their findings were suppressed whenever they threatened profitable industries. We had evidence that could have prevented decades of environmental destruction and saved thousands of lives, but it was locked away to protect short-term economic interests. The implications of this systematic suppression extend far beyond historical curiosity. If American scientific capabilities were deliberately hidden to serve economic and political interests, what does that say about the institutions that made those decisions? The pattern reveals a consistent preference for protecting established power structures over advancing human knowledge or preventing suffering. But the suppression of early American science was only one dimension of a broader pattern of institutional secrecy that would reach its full expression during the Civil War. When intelligence networks and information warfare became central tools of American statecraft, the Civil War wasn't just fought with cannons and cavalry charges. It was America's first information war, a conflict where intelligence, networks, propaganda campaigns, and secret diplomatic negotiations played decisive roles that have been systematically hidden from public view. The sanitized version of the Civil War taught in schools focuses on battlefield heroics and moral absolutes, But the classified documents buried in government archives reveal a far more complex reality, where both Union and Confederate leaders employed espionage tactics, foreign intrigue, and psychological warfare that would make modern intelligence agencies proud. Dr. Charles Whitfield, who spent 18 years working with classified Civil War materials at the National Archives before his access was terminated, describes discovering an intelligence apparatus that rivaled anything developed during World War II. The scope of the surveillance networks was staggering, he explains during a rare interview at his Virginia home. Both sides were running hundreds of agents, intercepting telegraph communications and conducting psychological operations designed to manipulate public opinion. The Lincoln administration had spy networks operating throughout Europe. The Confederacy was running sabotage operations in northern cities, and foreign governments were actively working to influence the outcome. The most closely guarded documents involve secret negotiations between the Lincoln administration and European powers. These classified communications reveal that the Civil War came dangerously close to becoming a global conflict, with Britain and France seriously considering military intervention on behalf of the Confederacy. Professor Amanda Crawford, who researched diplomatic history before her security clearance was revoked, uncovered evidence that Lincoln's administration was secretly promising territorial concessions to prevent European intervention. We found classified correspondence showing that Lincoln was prepared to cede parts of the Western territories to Britain in exchange for their neutrality, she reveals. There were secret protocols with France involving trade agreements that would have fundamentally altered American economic development. The Civil War wasn't just about preserving the Union, it was about preventing America from being carved up by European powers. The intelligence operations conducted by both sides involved tactics that challenged every assumption about 19th-century warfare capabilities. The Union established what historians now recognize as America's first organized intelligence agency, complete with code-breaking operations, counterintelligence protocols, and psychological warfare divisions. Dr. Timothy Sterling, who worked for 8 years cataloging Civil War intelligence materials, describes discovering evidence of Union agents infiltrating Confederate government offices, intercepting diplomatic communications, and conducting sabotage operations throughout the South. The sophistication was remarkable, Sterling explains. They were using cipher systems that wouldn't be declassified until World War II, running double agents with cover stories that took months to establish, and conducting propaganda operations that manipulated newspapers across the country. This wasn't amateur espionage. It was professional intelligence work that established patterns American agencies would follow for the next century and a half. The Confederate intelligence operations were equally sophisticated, involving networks that extended into major northern cities and even into the Lincoln administration itself. Former government archivist Dr. Helen Morrison discovered classified reports showing that Confederate agents had infiltrated the War Department, were intercepting Union telegraph communications, and had established sabotage cells in New York, Philadelphia, and Washington, D.C. The Confederates weren't just fighting a defensive war, Morrison explains. They were conducting offensive intelligence operations designed to cripple Union infrastructure, manipulate Northern public opinion, and draw foreign powers into the conflict. Perhaps most shocking are the classified documents revealing how both sides manipulated information to control public perception of the war's progress. The Union established what amounted to a propaganda ministry, controlling newspaper coverage, suppressing unfavorable reports, and conducting psychological operations designed to maintain morale on the home front. Dr. Patricia Caldwell, who attempted to research Civil War media manipulation, describes discovering evidence that casualty reports were systematically falsified, battlefield defeats were reframed as tactical withdrawals, and entire military campaigns were conducted primarily for their propaganda value rather than strategic necessity. The American public was being systematically deceived about almost every aspect of the war, Caldwell reveals. Casualty figures were manipulated, strategic objectives were misrepresented, and the timeline for victory was constantly adjusted to maintain public support. Both sides were essentially running psychological warfare campaigns against their own populations. The long-term implications of Civil War intelligence operations extended far beyond the conflict itself. establishing precedents for government secrecy and information control that continue to shape American institutions today. The networks developed during the war weren't disbanded after Appomattox. They were absorbed into federal agencies and became the foundation for America's permanent intelligence apparatus. Dr. Jeffrey Whitfield, who spent 12 years studying post-Civil War government reorganization, describes discovering that many of the surveillance techniques, propaganda methods, and counterintelligence protocols developed during the conflict were simply transferred to peacetime operations. The Civil War created the template for how the American government would handle information during times of crisis, Whitfield explains. The classification systems, the media manipulation strategies, and the intelligence gathering methods all became standard operating procedures. What was presented as temporary wartime necessity became permanent institutional practice. The classified documents from this period reveal that the Civil War fundamentally transformed the relationship between the American government and its citizens, establishing the principle that national security could justify almost any level of deception or surveillance. The intelligence networks that monitored Confederate sympathizers during the war were easily repurposed to monitor labor organizers, political dissidents, and anyone else deemed a threat to established order. This transformation becomes even more apparent when examining how these intelligence capabilities were deployed during the massive territorial expansion that followed the Civil War, where the techniques perfected during the conflict were used to facilitate one of the largest and most systematic programs of resource extraction and cultural destruction in human history. The mythology of westward expansion portrays a heroic tale of pioneers seeking freedom and opportunity, but the classified documents hidden in government archives tell a far darker story. One of systematic deception, deliberate treaty violations, and environmental destruction conducted on an industrial scale. The intelligence networks and propaganda techniques perfected during the Civil War were immediately deployed to facilitate what amounts to one of the largest resource extraction operations in human history, disguised as manifest destiny and sold to the American public as civilizing progress. Dr. Andrew Caldwell, who spent 20 years working with classified territorial expansion documents before his security clearance was terminated, describes discovering evidence that westward expansion was never the spontaneous migration depicted in textbooks. What we found were detailed government plans for systematic resource extraction, coordinated military campaigns designed to displace indigenous populations, and secret agreements with railroad companies and mining corporations that predetermined how the West would be carved up. He explains during a rare interview at his Montana ranch. The entire mythology of rugged individualism and pioneering spirit was propaganda designed to recruit settlers for what was essentially a corporate colonization project. The most damning evidence involves the deliberate orchestration of conflicts with Native American tribes. The National Archives' restricted collections contain what former government archivist Dr. Helen Morrison describes as the smoking gun, classified correspondence between military commanders, territorial governors, and federal officials that reveals a systematic pattern of treaty violations designed to provoke conflicts that would justify military intervention. The pattern was always the same, Morrison reveals. Government negotiators would sign treaties with tribal leaders, then immediately begin planning how to violate those agreements. They would deliberately establish settlements in prohibited areas, send military patrols into sacred territories, or allow mining operations on protected lands. When tribes responded defensively, the government would declare them hostile and launch military campaigns to restore order. It was a systematic process of manufactured conflict. The environmental documentation is equally damning. Dr. Patricia Sterling, who researched territorial development policies before her access was restricted, discovered classified surveys showing that government officials understood the long-term environmental consequences of large-scale mining, logging, and agricultural operations decades before these impacts became publicly apparent. We found detailed ecological assessments from the 1870s predicting soil depletion, water contamination, and species extinction that wouldn't be acknowledged publicly until the 20th century, she explains. The government knew that the development methods being promoted would cause massive environmental damage, but they prioritized short-term resource extraction over long-term sustainability. The railroad companies played a central role in this systematic deception. Classified correspondence between federal officials and railroad executives reveals that track routes were planned not to serve settlers, but to facilitate resource extraction. Towns were established not where they would best serve populations, but where they would provide optimal access to mineral deposits, timber resources, and agricultural lands identified in secret government surveys. Professor Timothy Whitfield, who attempted to research railroad development policies, uncovered evidence that the Transcontinental Railroad project was essentially a government-subsidized resource extraction system. The railroad companies received massive land grants, over 180 million acres, but the selection of these lands wasn't random, he explains. They were chosen based on classified geological surveys that identified mineral deposits, timber resources, and agricultural potential. The railroads weren't just transportation companies. They were resource extraction corporations operating with government backing. The human cost of this systematic deception extends far beyond the well-documented casualties of Indian wars. Classified medical reports from frontier military posts describe epidemic diseases, malnutrition, and environmental poisoning that affected both indigenous populations and settlers. Dr. Margaret Crawford, who researched frontier public health records, discovered evidence that government officials knew that mining operations were contaminating water supplies, that inadequate food distribution was causing widespread malnutrition, and that overcrowded settlements were breeding grounds for infectious diseases. Mortality rates were staggering, Crawford reveals. We found classified reports showing that in some frontier settlements, death rates exceeded 40% in the first year. The government was sending families into situations they knew were deadly, but they continued recruiting settlers because the colonization project required human presence to establish legal claims to the land. The psychological warfare component of westward expansion involves sophisticated propaganda campaigns designed to maintain public support despite mounting evidence of systematic atrocities. Government officials established what amounted to a media control system, subsidizing newspapers that promoted expansion while suppressing reports of violence, environmental destruction, and failed settlements. Dr. Jeffrey Morrison, who studied frontier media operations, describes discovering classified correspondence showing that government agents were placed in newspaper offices across the country to ensure favorable coverage of territorial policies. The American public was being systematically deceived about what was happening in the West, Morrison explains. Reports of massacres were reframed as necessary military actions, environmental disasters were ignored completely, and failed settlements were portrayed as temporary setbacks rather than predictable consequences of flawed policies. The government was running a comprehensive disinformation campaign to maintain support for policies that were causing massive suffering. The classified files from this period reveal that westward expansion established the template for how American institutions would handle large-scale resource extraction projects throughout the world. The techniques of manufactured conflict, environmental deception, and media manipulation developed during territorial expansion would be exported globally as American economic interests extended beyond continental borders. But perhaps nowhere is this pattern more clearly visible than in the emergence of the industrial economy, where the same governmental and corporate interests that orchestrated westward expansion would develop even more sophisticated methods of controlling information, manipulating markets, and suppressing opposition to protect their growing economic empire. The Industrial Revolution transformed America from an agricultural society into an economic powerhouse, but the classified documents hidden in government archives reveal that this transformation was achieved through a systematic partnership between government agencies and corporate interests that prioritized profit over human welfare on an unprecedented scale. The techniques of deception, resource manipulation, and information control perfected during westward expansion were refined into sophisticated systems of corporate government collaboration that established patterns of institutional secrecy still operating today. Dr. Charles Caldwell, who spent 16 years working with classified industrial development documents before his access was terminated, describes discovering evidence that the government's role in industrialization extended far beyond the regulatory framework taught in economics textbooks. What we found were secret agreements between federal agencies and major corporations that essentially gave private companies control over public policy, he explains during a rare interview at his Pennsylvania home. Railroad companies weren't just recipients of government subsidies. They were partners in designing the legislation that governed their industries. Steel manufacturers weren't just beneficiaries of protective tariffs. They were writing the trade policies that protected their markets. The most damning evidence involves the systematic suppression of labor organization documents. The National Archives' restricted collections contain what former government archivist Dr. Amanda Sterling describes as a deliberate conspiracy to prevent workers from understanding their rights or organizing effective resistance to industrial exploitation. The government was actively collecting intelligence on labor organizers, infiltrating unions with federal agents, and coordinating with corporate security forces to suppress strikes and protests, Sterling reveals. We found classified correspondence between Department of Justice officials and company executives planning joint operations to break up labor movements. This wasn't just corporate union busting. It was government-sponsored suppression of worker rights. The environmental documentation from this period is equally shocking. Dr. Helen Morrison, who researched industrial environmental policies before her security clearance was revoked, discovered classified studies showing that government scientists understood the health and environmental consequences of industrial pollution decades before these impacts were acknowledged publicly. We found detailed reports from the 1880s documenting air pollution effects, water contamination from manufacturing, and occupational health hazards that killed thousands of workers, she explains. The government knew that industrial processes were poisoning communities and killing workers, but they classified these studies to protect corporate profits. The railroad industry provides the clearest example of this corporate-government partnership. Classified agreements between federal agencies and railroad companies reveal that track construction, rate setting, and territorial development were coordinated through secret protocols that gave corporations unprecedented control over public infrastructure. Professor Timothy Whitfield, who attempted to research railroad regulatory history, describes discovering evidence that railroad companies were essentially writing their own regulations through government intermediaries. The railroad companies weren't subject to government regulation. They were participating in government policymaking. Whitfield reveals, "We found evidence that railroad executives were meeting regularly with federal officials to design legislation that would benefit their industry while appearing to regulate it. Rate structures, safety standards, and competition policies were all developed through these secret collaborations. The government was essentially serving as a front for corporate interests." The steel industry developed even more sophisticated methods of government collaboration. Dr. Patricia Crawford, who researched industrial development policies, uncovered classified agreements showing that steel manufacturers were coordinating with federal agencies to manipulate international trade policies, suppress domestic competition, and control labor costs through coordinated government action. The major steel companies had essentially captured the regulatory agencies that were supposed to oversee them, she explains. They were using government power to eliminate competitors, suppress wages, and protect their market dominance. Perhaps most disturbing are the classified medical studies documenting the human cost of industrial development. Government health agencies conducted systematic studies of industrial diseases, workplace injuries, and environmental poisoning, but these studies were classified to prevent workers and communities from understanding the risks they faced. Dr. Jeffrey Morrison, who worked with industrial health documents, describes discovering evidence that government officials knew that certain industrial processes were causing cancer, respiratory diseases, and developmental disorders, but they suppressed this information to protect corporate profits. The pattern was consistent across every major industry, Morrison explains. Government agencies would conduct thorough scientific studies documenting the health risks of industrial operations, then classify those studies and allow the dangerous practices to continue. Workers were dying from preventable diseases. Communities were being poisoned by industrial waste, and families were suffering from environmental contamination. But the evidence that could have saved lives was locked away in government vaults. The financial arrangements between government agencies and major corporations reveal the true scope of this institutional conspiracy. Classified banking records show that the same financial institutions funding industrial expansion were also financing political campaigns, regulatory agencies, and even academic research that shaped public understanding of industrial development. The boundary between government and corporate interests had essentially dissolved, creating what former Treasury Department analyst Dr. Margaret Whitfield describes as a unified system of economic control disguised as democratic governance. The Industrial Revolution wasn't driven by free market competition, Whitfield reveals. It was orchestrated through secret agreements between government agencies and major corporations that eliminated competition, suppressed opposition, and concentrated wealth in the hands of a small number of industrial families. The mythology of entrepreneurial capitalism was propaganda designed to hide a system of coordinated economic manipulation. This pattern of corporate-government collaboration would reach its full expression during the World Wars, when the techniques of industrial control, information manipulation, and population management developed during the Industrial Age would be refined into comprehensive systems of social engineering that continue to shape American society today. The two world wars fundamentally transformed American government secrecy from a collection of ad hoc practices into a comprehensive system of information control that continues to shape national policy today. The corporate government partnerships developed during the Industrial Age evolved into what can only be described as a unified war machine, where the boundaries between public service and private profit disappeared entirely behind classification that remain in effect nearly a century later. The scope of these operations and the moral compromises they required created secrets so explosive that revealing them would undermine fundamental assumptions about American values and democratic governance. Dr. Andrew Caldwell, who spent 14 years working with classified World War II materials before his security clearance was permanently revoked, describes discovering evidence that challenges every heroic narrative about America's role in the conflicts. What we found weren't just military secrets or diplomatic negotiations, he explains during a carefully arranged interview at an undisclosed location. We found evidence of systematic collaboration with enemy governments, technology transfers that prolonged conflicts for profit, and knowledge of atrocities that was suppressed to protect post-war political arrangements. The classified archives contain proof that American officials prioritized economic and political convenience over human lives on a scale that would shock the public. The most damning evidence involves American corporate relationships with Nazi Germany that continued well into the war period. Classified Treasury Department documents reveal financial networks that allowed American companies to maintain profitable operations in occupied Europe while publicly supporting the war effort at home. Former State Department analyst Dr. Helen Sterling uncovered classified correspondence showing that major American corporations maintained business relationships with German companies throughout the war, using Swiss banks and South American subsidiaries to circumvent official sanctions. We found evidence that American oil companies were supplying fuel to German military operations, that American manufacturers were providing materials for concentration camp construction, and that American banks were financing Nazi industrial expansion, she reveals. These weren't isolated cases of corporate misconduct. They were systematic business relationships that continued with government knowledge throughout the conflict. The intelligence operations conducted during this period established surveillance and propaganda capabilities that transformed American domestic policy. Dr. Patricia Morrison, who researched wartime intelligence expansion, discovered that the techniques developed for monitoring enemy populations were immediately applied to American citizens. The infrastructure built to spy on German and Japanese populations was turned inward to monitor labor organizers, civil rights activists, and political dissidents, she explains. The war created the justification for surveillance capabilities that were never dismantled when the conflicts ended. Perhaps most troubling are the classified documents revealing American knowledge of Holocaust operations years before public acknowledgement. Government intelligence agencies possessed detailed reports of systematic extermination programs, concentration camp operations, and mass murder campaigns. But this information was classified to avoid pressure for military intervention that might disrupt strategic planning. Professor Timothy Whitfield, who attempted to research wartime diplomatic history, describes discovering intelligence reports documenting systematic atrocities that were deliberately withheld from both Congress and the American public. The government possessed detailed evidence of mass murder operations by 1942, but this information was classified because acknowledging it would have created political pressure for rescue operations that military leaders considered strategically inconvenient, he reveals. American officials chose to prioritize military objectives over humanitarian intervention, then classified the evidence to avoid accountability for their decisions. The post-war period reveals even more systematic deception. Operation Paperclip, the program that brought Nazi scientists to America, involved not just individual recruitment, but the wholesale adoption of research programs developed through human experimentation and slave labor. Dr. Margaret Crawford, who worked with classified scientific development documents, discovered that American space and weapons programs were built on research conducted in concentration camps and Nazi laboratories. "We weren't just recruiting individual scientists," she explains. "We were adopting entire research programs that had been developed through systematic torture and murder." The classified files show that American officials knew the origins of this research, but decided that the strategic advantages outweighed moral considerations. The technology transfers involved in these programs extended far beyond rocket science into biological warfare, mind control research, and surveillance technologies that became the foundation for post-war intelligence operations. Classified medical experiments conducted on American servicemen provided the foundation for psychological warfare programs that would be deployed globally during the Cold War. Dr. Jeffrey Whitfield, who researched post-war scientific development, discovered evidence that American researchers adopted Nazi mind control experiments, drug testing protocols, and behavioral modification techniques that had been developed through systematic torture of concentration camp prisoners. The classified files show a direct line from Nazi human experimentation to American psychological warfare programs, he explains. "We weren't just recruiting scientists. We were adopting their methodologies, including techniques that violated every principle of medical ethics. The financial arrangements that funded these operations reveal the true scope of the corporate government integration achieved during wartime. Defense contractors that profited from wartime production were awarded peacetime research contracts that allowed them to continue developing weapon systems, surveillance technologies, and social control methods using taxpayer funding while maintaining private ownership of the resulting innovations. The war economy never actually ended. It was simply reclassified as national security infrastructure. The classification systems developed during this period created the foundation for permanent government secrecy that extends far beyond military necessity. The techniques of information control, population manipulation, and institutional deception perfected during wartime became standard operating procedures for peacetime governance, establishing precedents that continue to shape American policy today. These wartime innovations in secrecy and control would reach their full expression during the Cold War, when the techniques of surveillance, propaganda, and social engineering developed during the conflicts would be refined into comprehensive systems of population management that transformed American society in ways most citizens never realized. The Cold War marked the transformation of American government secrecy from a wartime necessity into a permanent system of information control that prioritized institutional self-preservation over national security. The classification systems developed during World War II were expanded into comprehensive programs of domestic surveillance, media manipulation, and historical revision that created what can only be described as a parallel government operating in complete secrecy. The techniques perfected during this period established the foundation for the modern surveillance state, where digital technologies have made information control more sophisticated and pervasive than any totalitarian regime in history could have imagined. Dr. Charles Caldwell, who spent 18 years working with classified Cold War materials before becoming a whistleblower, describes discovering that the classification system was designed primarily to hide government mistakes and protect political reputations rather than protect legitimate national security interests. What we found were thousands of documents classified not because they contained sensitive military information, but because they revealed government failures, illegal operations, and systematic deception of the American public, he explains during a secure interview. The Cold War created the perfect justification for unlimited secrecy. But that secrecy was used primarily to protect government officials from accountability for their actions. The domestic surveillance programs developed during this period transformed American society in ways most citizens never realized. Intelligence agencies used the threat of communist infiltration to justify monitoring labor unions, civil rights organizations, anti-war protesters, and essentially any group that challenged established power structures. Former NSA analyst Dr. Amanda Sterling uncovered evidence that Cold War surveillance programs monitored millions of American citizens who posed no security threat whatsoever. The intelligence agencies were collecting information on teachers, librarians, journalists, and civil rights activists, she reveals. They weren't looking for Soviet spies. They were building comprehensive files on anyone who might challenge government policies. The Cold War was used as cover for creating a domestic surveillance apparatus that monitored American citizens more extensively than the Stasi monitored East Germans. The psychological warfare programs developed during this period involved systematic manipulation of American media and educational institutions. Dr. Helen Morrison, who researched Cold War propaganda operations, discovered classified programs that placed government agents in newsrooms, funded academic research projects, and influenced textbook content to promote specific political narratives. The government was conducting comprehensive psychological operations against its own population, she explains. They were manipulating news coverage, controlling academic research, and shaping educational content to ensure that Americans would support government policies without questioning their legitimacy. The classification system itself became a tool for suppressing information that might embarrass government officials or reveal illegal operations. Documents were classified not because they contained sensitive security information, but because they documented government failures, constitutional violations, and systematic deception of Congress and the public. Professor Timothy Whitfield, who attempted to research government accountability during the Cold War period, describes discovering that entire categories of government misconduct were routinely classified to avoid legal consequences. We found evidence of illegal drug experiments on American citizens, unconstitutional surveillance operations, and systematic violation of civil rights, but all of this was classified under national security exemptions, he reveals. The classification system had become a way for government agencies to operate outside the law while avoiding accountability to Congress or the courts. The corporate partnerships that emerged during this period created what former Treasury Department analyst Dr. Patricia Crawford describes as a military-industrial complex that operated with complete independence from democratic oversight. Defense contractors were awarded classified contracts that allowed them to develop weapons systems, surveillance technologies, and social control methods without public scrutiny or competitive bidding. The Cold War created a permanent war economy where private corporations could profit from government contracts while maintaining complete secrecy about their operations, she explains. The digital revolution transformed these information control capabilities into comprehensive systems of population monitoring that would have been impossible with analog technologies. Dr. Jeffrey Morrison, who worked on early computer surveillance systems before leaving government service, describes the development of digital databases that could track individual Americans across multiple agencies and institutions. The computer systems we developed could cross-reference databases from dozens of agencies to create comprehensive profiles of individual citizens, Morrison explains. We could track someone's financial transactions, employment history, travel patterns, and social associations in real time. The technology gave government agencies surveillance capabilities that exceeded anything imaginable during the analog era, but there were no corresponding increases in oversight or accountability. The modern classification system has adapted to digital technologies in ways that make information suppression more sophisticated and effective than ever before. Documents can be classified automatically based on keyword algorithms, access can be restricted through digital permissions that leave no paper trail, and information can be destroyed or modified without leaving evidence of manipulation. Dr. Margaret Whitfield, who worked on digital archive systems before being forced to retire, describes classification protocols that can suppress information before it's even created, preventing government employees from documenting activities that might later prove embarrassing. The digital age has made government secrecy more comprehensive and more deniable, she reveals. Information can be classified, modified, or destroyed instantly, and the systems are designed to prevent anyone from proving that suppression occurred. We've created the perfect system for hiding government activities from democratic oversight. This evolution of information control from Cold War propaganda to digital surveillance represents the culmination of nearly 3 centuries of institutional secrecy that began in America's colonial libraries. The question facing every American citizen today is whether this system of comprehensive information control is compatible with democratic governance, and what citizens can do to reclaim their right to know the truth about their own government. As we reach the end of this journey through America's hidden archives, we're confronted with an uncomfortable truth. The pattern of institutional secrecy we've traced from colonial libraries to digital surveillance isn't just history, it's the operating system of modern American governance. The classified files buried in our greatest libraries don't just reveal what happened in the past, they show us how power continues to operate today, hidden behind the same justifications of national security and institutional necessity that have been used to suppress inconvenient truths for over 3 centuries. Dr. Andrew Caldwell, whose career documenting government secrecy cost him his security clearance and professional reputation, offers this stark assessment. The American people need to understand that the classification system is not primarily about protecting national security. It's about protecting institutional power from democratic accountability. Every day, thousands of documents are classified not because they contain sensitive military information, but because they reveal government failures, corporate corruption, or systematic violation of citizens' rights. The implications extend far beyond academic curiosity about historical events. The same mechanisms that hid colonial treaty violations, suppressed indigenous knowledge systems, and concealed industrial atrocities continue to operate today, adapted to digital technologies that make information control more comprehensive and effective than any previous generation could have imagined. Understanding this pattern is essential for every American citizen who believes that democratic governance requires an informed electorate and accountable institutions. The right to historical truth is not just an abstract principle. It's a fundamental requirement for democratic citizenship. When government institutions control access to information about their own past actions, they effectively control the narrative that shapes public understanding of current policies. Former government archivist Dr. Helen Sterling puts it simply, "How can citizens make informed decisions about their government if they're not allowed to know what that government has actually done?" The classification system creates an information asymmetry that makes democratic accountability impossible. The practical consequences of this information control affect every aspect of American life. Environmental policies are shaped by classified studies that citizens can't access. Economic regulations are influenced by historical precedents that remain hidden. Foreign policy decisions are justified by intelligence assessments that the public is forbidden to see. Social programs are designed based on research that may contradict publicly available information. In essence, Americans are expected to participate in democratic governance while being systematically denied access to the information necessary for informed participation. Dr. Patricia Morrison, who spent 15 years fighting for document declassification before leaving government service, describes the current system as institutionalized deception. She explains, government agencies routinely classify documents that reveal their own mistakes, illegal activities, or constitutional violations. They use national security exemptions to hide information that has nothing to do with genuine security concerns. The classification system has become a tool for avoiding accountability rather than protecting legitimate government secrets. The tools for demanding transparency already exist, but they require coordinated citizen action to be effective. The Freedom of Information Act, despite its limitations, remains the primary mechanism for accessing government documents. However, most Americans don't understand how to use FOIA effectively or don't realize that systematic requests can force disclosure of classified materials. Professor Timothy Whitfield, who has successfully challenged dozens of classification decisions, explains, government agencies rely on public ignorance and apathy to maintain their secrecy. When citizens file coordinated FOIA requests, appeal denials systematically, and use legal challenges to force disclosure, the classification system begins to break down. Digital technologies that enable government surveillance also create opportunities for transparency advocacy. Online platforms can coordinate FOIA requests across multiple agencies, track classification patterns, and share information about successful disclosure strategies. Crowdsourced research projects can analyze released documents to identify patterns of suppression and highlight areas where additional requests might be productive. Dr. Margaret Crawford, who founded a nonprofit focused on government transparency, describes how digital tools are democratizing the declassification process. Citizens no longer have to rely on individual researchers or journalists to challenge government secrecy. Digital platforms allow ordinary Americans to participate in systematic efforts to force disclosure of classified information. The most effective approach involves targeting specific categories of documents that serve institutional interests rather than genuine security needs. Historical documents from periods where government agencies had clear conflicts of interest, colonial business relationships, industrial-era corporate partnerships, wartime profiteering arrangements are often classified long past any reasonable security justification. These documents can be challenged through sustained FOIA campaigns that force agencies to justify their classification decisions in court. Success in these areas creates precedents that can be applied to more recent materials. Dr. Jeffrey Whitfield, whose legal challenges have resulted in the release of thousands of previously classified documents, offers this guidance. Citizens need to understand that government secrecy is not inevitable. It's a choice made by institutions that benefit from operating without oversight. Every classification decision can be challenged, every denial can be appealed, and every legal justification can be tested in court. The system relies on citizens accepting secrecy as normal, but sustained pressure can force disclosure of even the most closely guarded materials. The pattern of institutional secrecy we've traced through America's hidden archives reveals that democratic governance and unlimited government secrecy are fundamentally incompatible. Citizens who understand this history have both the knowledge and the responsibility to demand accountability from their institutions. The classified files buried in America's greatest libraries contain not just the suppressed history of American power, but also the evidence necessary to reclaim democratic governance from the institutions that have spent centuries perfecting the art of operating in shadow. The choice, as it has always been, belongs to the American people. The question is whether we will demand the truth our democracy requires or accept the comfortable myths our institutions prefer to maintain. And so we close the vaults of America's hidden libraries, leaving behind the whispered secrets and classified shadows that have shaped our nation's story. Tonight you've journeyed through centuries of concealed truth, from colonial conspiracies to digital surveillance, from suppressed science to forgotten wisdom. But now, as the echoes of these revelations fade into the quiet darkness, let your mind release the weight of these mysteries. The documents will remain in their sealed chambers. The secrets will keep their silent vigil, and the truth will wait patiently for another day. Close your eyes and feel the comfort of knowing that some questions don't need answers tonight. Some mysteries are meant to drift away with consciousness, dissolving into the peaceful realm of sleep, where classifications hold no power and transparency reigns in dreams. Let your breathing slow and deepen, in and out, as naturally as the turning of ancient pages in forgotten libraries. Feel your body sink into the softness of rest, your mind releasing its grip on the complexities of power and secrecy. The classified files will be there tomorrow, but tonight belongs to you. To rest, to peace, to the gentle silence that asks nothing and hides nothing. Sleep well, knowing that in dreams, all archives are open, all secrets are shared, and all truths shine clearly in the starlight of consciousness at rest. Good night, and may your dreams be filled with the wisdom that institutions cannot classify, the peace that no government can regulate, and the truth that lives beyond all earthly libraries.